we've been legal advocates for the last 30, 40 years, and we've been dealing with cases from Haiti to New York City to even cases of nuke materials in outer space. And we've been finding that a lot of the law has been definitely disjointed, and the science has been disjointed in terms of not serving people in the environmental justice community. Oh boy, I think we have a problem here. Hold on. So the case that we've been working for 3-4 years has been a microcosm, I think, of all environmental justice and a lot of environmental health problems, is a NYCHA development in Lower Manhattan, right by the East River and the Brooklyn Bridge. They got hit. We first came across them from World Trade Center. They're the one closest to the World Trade Center disaster. And we just have to point out also is that it was the EJI, the law project, that collected samples by the World Trade Center that had it tested, that opened up the whole can of worms that we were in danger in terms of asbestos, lead, and all the other materials that were there. Smith residences are definitely a home to multiple vulnerable populations. And that's what we have to remember, that a lot of the science in terms of public health uses standards that applies to an Olympic runner. And they'll just cherry pick those figures, those SEO figures or whatever. And it's definitely a systematic underassessment on environmental health impact and also even the physical sciences. So we have to keep on fighting back. And at Smith, we have 9/11 World Trade Center disaster victims, high levels as asthma, population covered by the ADA. They got hit with Hurricane Sandy. And now there's many COVID victims. Here's the flooding that took place. And we're really concerned that a lot of the federal money now, oh boy, I'm sorry about this, is going towards disaster relief. And a lot of that is not being spent the right way. It's actually creating more problems. And NYCHA at Smith has many, many trees, and those trees help prevent flooding and the like. And the work that's being done now is actually hurting those trees. And NYCHA, 1 in 14 people live in New York City live in NYCHA housing, and it is estimated to be 50 to 100,000 trees in New York City housing developments. And a lot of them are actually in danger now. Then we have a contract that for $85 million, that it issues all these protections on the tree work that they're doing to put utilities in and construction sites. They're trenching, and a lot of the work that is prescribed to protect those trees were ignored. And a lot, I would say, that I've learned in science is that there's also systematic underassessment of baseline. Every site they were working on, we should get out there and do the baseline and do it in a way that we create a prima facie case that more work's got to be done by either the government or the contractor or anyone coming up with the environmental impact statement. And there's standards out there for tree protection, for soil or whatever. It's in the contracts and they just don't follow them. And here's the effects of previous construction. It's utility lines, federal money, and they just completely ignored the caution sites. Not only that, the construction unearthed a lot of the soil that's here. And if you can see that there's no window protections, the soil dispersion is going up into these windows. Tree protection plans are just totally ignored, causing more soil buildup. And a lot of the soil problems is compaction from all that equipment that's there, and which leads to not only the death of the trees or impairment, but also when next time there's a flood, it just impairs the landscape's ability to absorb that water. So we're very concerned about the physical structure of soil, protecting it and making sure that it's not being impaired. And we're having a major problem and speaking to the federal people tomorrow. In order to undo soil compaction, there's different ways of doing it, including spoken wheel trenching. There's also air. They basically use an air gun to shoot air into the roots loosen up that soil around the roots so the roots could breathe. They agreed to do this. And then we showed that there's a problem with air spading that causes some air dispersion, and asked that they contain it in the right way. They said, no, Joel, you pointed out that there's contaminants in the soil and we don't want to deal with contaminants being dispersed, even though they cause a tree problem. So here's showing that the lack of their proper protection. And this is if 2-3 years, they continue to still do the bad work. So part of our problem is governmental enforcement of these laws and regulations. And what's scary about Smith is that not only is it public space, that there's 3 levels of government involved: the federal, the state, and the city. And it was most of the soil sampling that was indicative of a problem was done on behalf of the Tenants Association, done by Urban Soils Institute and 2 of my interns. Show it. Then we have bad players. And this is Navalis, is the main contractor. And I think it's important to point out where it's important in getting the science out there is that we have players that have a lot of pull, and it's hard figuring out how to get them to do the right bit. And we've been fighting for 3-4 years. And I also want to point out that only yesterday, the principals of Navalis were indicted and found guilty of tax fraud and lying about their employment practices, which has to do with their labor practices. We kept on complaining. The NYCHA compliance officer claimed there was no issue in 2018. We just had the same almost discussions this morning with NYCHA. No, just basically just letting it fly in the wind. And part of the problem that we have a concern about, which touches on some of the greenwashing that's going on, is that NYCHA and other groups do pilot programs. So they're doing 1 or 2 good programs up in the Bronx or whatever, and they'll show that they're planting a few trees and they're protecting the soil, but they're not doing it most of the places. So I think it's really important that people keep an independent voice and willing to criticize even the places that give us grants. This is just showing that part of the problem at Smith is the construction, and above the ground is pruning. We're finding out that there's bad pruning that goes on in terms of the trees. NYCHA spent over $1 million to deal with the trees without arborists telling them what to do and not to do. So there's a self-interest in terms of not reporting what's going on. That's bad. And we've been pushing the iTree program. We're trying to bring the U.S. Forest Service in to actually show the real value of the trees that are being lost and the vegetation in the soils and all the resiliency that's there. NYCHA itself has been critical of protection zones, and yet they've been ignoring this. And it's not just at Smith. This is happening in Baruch, which is about half a mile north of Smith. They basically took down 100 trees on the ground that the trees were contaminated or tainted, not contaminated, they were sick. And you can see this soil is just exposed. And we know that it's not just PM 2.5, we have high levels of lead, PAHs, VOCs, and even arsenic. And we're really concerned on the health issue is that the law requires that these things be covered, and they're not. And you also notice that this is, we also keep on getting that the soil that keeps on coming up is legacy soil, construction soil, and it's used, I guess, in a non-pejorative sense. They're trying to just say that we're not responsible for it, but they're still unearthing these soils. And that's what we should be concerned about. Not just what's in the soil, but the exposure that's being created by improper practices. And here they're actually adding more silica to the soil that's on the ground. They're cutting concrete without any type of protection for the workers. They're paying for a monitor, but we caught the air monitor around the corner. All right. So a lot of the air monitoring reports that we get are not true and not accurate. One area monitoring report we got that there was exceedances of PM 2.5. And what they did is they said it was because there was so much heat, and also there was construction equipment there. So what they did is they did something not scientific. They just moved the monitor away from the site, a little further away from the site. So we have to really question and be really vigilant on the figures that we're given, how they're given, how they're corrected, and also which parties are involved. And we learned from 9/11, what got to most of the people that's in the lungs wasn't the whole list of chemicals, it was silica alone. And here, we're talking about soils that are being exposed. If you see on the left, the open portal, that is the crawl space. We're fighting them for a long time to even make sure that the air monitoring was taking place during construction at the in the crawl space. They refused, and yet we looked at NYCHA's documents stating that give us this money because when Sandy hit, it actually dislodged the asbestos and lead that was in the basement infrastructure, mixing it with the soil in the crawl space. To this day, NYCHA has yet to analyze analyze the soil. We also know there's fiberglass that was recently just removed. And part of the problem I'm finding, and it's really important for us to be vigilant soil collectors to make a prima facie case, is that they'll get away without doing any testing and just hope that basically the storm passes over. And this is a temporary conclusion, but they're definitely in violation of the FEMA agreement. They're not enforcing the law. There's a lot of laws that apply that we'll deal with another issue, but one of it is that NYCHA, as their landlord, is not respecting the health of their residents, and they're not respecting the viability of their own trees and their landscape. And they definitely have a duty of care, and they're in violation of a lot of other state and federal laws in terms of protecting people's health. We sought help from quite a few different city and state agencies in terms of just even showing that NYCHA is not doing significant analysis of the soils, that their sampling is not scientific, is not robust enough, and is actually giving us false information. And I got to say that a lot of middle-level people said that they definitely helped in terms of technical help. When it came to they went to the higher-ups in their agencies, and the agency said, we can't help, we don't have jurisdiction because it's not a brownfield. It's not a brownfield because people live here. They said, it doesn't make sense, but we can't help you. So there's a lot of, I would say even city and state plans and programs and million tree programs, but it really push comes to shove that they won't participate in the plans of finding out what's really there. Here's all information about the crawl space. And we pointed out, first that we're going to remove the fiberglass, and then part of the problem with soil contamination in the soils is that there's a lot of raw sewage that's coming down. And even the workers at Smith said that there was raw sewage, a lot of it was flowing into the soil. We got the health department to come in. The city's health department standard was that they'll only issue a violation if they see the soil being wet or there's a smell. All right, which totally, to me, disregards the whole bit of accumulated contamination, what's below the ground, not just what's in the surface. And I also have to point out that one of the big cases that we did is the first lawyer on the case against the United States and UN for the cholera outbreak in Haiti. It was the excrement of 13 soldiers that was unconfined, that went into the water supply, into the water basin, that definitely was connected and caused 10,000 cholera deaths. So we were answered when we had this raw sewage going into the soil and into people's apartments, that why we're concerned, Joel and your group, we don't see that much, sewage. And when it was going through the roofs of the roof, we were told there wasn't that much pigeon shit there. So I'm sorry if I'm a little nonlinear, but it's been denial after denial and fighting this. And not only we're back to the crawl space, when they applied for this money, $85 million, and they had to come back again to do more storm recovery work. The costs related to the removal and disposal of contaminated soils within the skull spaces will be included in the environmental allowance. They admitted that there's a problem. Yeah, crawl space, which was contaminated with asbestos-containing insulation that fell from the piping after the surge of floodwaters. So here they use this statement to say that there's contamination and asbestos, and yet when we asked them to clean up to check, they said, we don't have to check, there's no more asbestos. Silica exposure that we explained before, and also what we found in the soils is not just PM 2.5, we found arsenic. We found 65 parts per million of arsenic in a tree well in a daycare center. This is a daycare center on NYCHA property. We complained to the health department, and the health department came back and said, this daycare center doesn't exist. We called back again and pushed them until finally they said, you're right, it does exist. We had a wrong address or an administrative address. It was USI that tested for us. We found 85 parts per million, 240 parts per million of arsenic right near building 4. We finally, after screaming to the New York City Health Department to come in, they issued a violation that this should be covered, especially being so close to residential areas. The SEO for arsenic is 13, and some people believe that it should be lower, all right? So even we find stuff way off the charts, we couldn't even get the health department, the state health department, or the feds to really do any more action. Then when the contractor hired their own people, following the laws, regulation for soil sampling, that we had exceedances, they admitted that there was high levels of arsenic and lead, that circled in red. But the worst thing is, in their executive summary, they just said that these were minor exceedances. So part of the problem that we face as an environmental justice attorney, we need your help all the time, and it's an ongoing battle, is that even getting access to the raw data and misinterpretation or just a downplay of what's out there. And how they punish these people is they gave them another $200–300 million worth of contracts elsewhere. And then we kept on bringing up that NYCHA is under federal jurisdiction primarily for the lead crisis in the children. And we kept on, and we're getting some leeway or some respect, that a lot of the lead is coming from the dust in the soil. And it's the uncovered soil that you saw before. And this one of the main documents that we cite is what happened in Detroit, Flint, that they realized it was seasonal. And a lot of the materials we also used was gleaned from USI Flora, that Milky from New Orleans and others, of showing how bad it is. And yet they're not taking it seriously. And COVID has hit all of us. And to me, this is one of the scariest reports that have come out. And this is a Harvard study, that an increase of only 1 microgram in PM 2.5 is associated with a 15% increase in COVID-19 death rate. That means this exposure to soil alone, PM 2.5, which is that soil that's floating by, causes increase. And other studies have shown that it leads to a large increase in COVID-19 death rate. So we bring this up, and they keep on saying we need more studies. We're going to look at it a little more. But I think this study and the studies that follow this should be a main, I think the main grounds of the new science that's out there, that we should take much more precaution in all our activities. Solutions, meaningful input from residents, activate leaders to implement necessary controls, alert politicians whose areas in Smith, roundtable of residents. We're doing all of this, and I think it's a little bit of an uphill battle. And also, why I get a little emotional is that each day I've been getting calls from whistleblowers, people that work for city, state, and federal agencies that are willing to speak up because they're told not to speak up, but they can't take it anymore. The problem with NYCHA is that some of the inspectors they just have less staff, and their job is to see if there's asbestos or lead. out there before workers come to disturb it. And a lot of work is being done without the proper inspections and not the proper clearance. So we just know that there's a problem. And I think the problem is that people up and down the line do not want to know. And then when we discovered the 85 parts per million of arsenic in the soil by the tree well, I and the tenant association president had to push the daycare center to take this seriously and not to allow the kids to touch that anymore, let alone do a cleanup. And they came back to us and they said, don't worry, we're going to send them to the city park around the corner or right next to us. And a week later, I went to photograph with my documentarian, and lo and behold, a big sign saying, beware, Roundup is being used. All right. So we feel guilty that we took the kids out of arsenic and put them into Roundup. The park's law department said, Joel, why are you getting so upset? We're just using the Roundup on the edge of the park site. So this is in the middle of even Mexico stopping the use of Roundup. And yet New York City parks only up until recently stopped using it. And to this day is still open that they're using Roundup in city golf courses. And that golf course happens to be up in the Bronx. So we're concerned about the people that expose, especially the workers. So pesticides is a major concern that we have throughout the whole city. And this is just a contract. They're talking about which soil methods, methodology, which ASTM standards they should use. So we get these contracts. We also get the reports. They're filled with pages and pages and pages. But as I pointed out before, it's not being really followed because we get the little statement, an executive summary, that it's de minimis or it's just minor exceedances. Tree destruction continues. Arsenic, just popping back to arsenic. Children may be exposed to arsenic by eating the soil, all right? And then what we did is we kept on putting chart after chart for 4 years of showing the exceedances. And I believe that our previous seminar this morning showed out with these PAHs of concern. They did find them. They found them alone and they just discounted it. And when we asked for air monitoring, we also asked not just for PM 2.5, we asked for VOC and SVOC monitoring, and they refused to do it. We complained to the city building department, and they just have not enforced that. So as I said, a broken record, it's systematic underassessment, and I take a lot of umbrage that the city, state, and federal is not pushing this through.